Greetings and a warm welcome to the lesson. Today in the governance and compliance audit session, we're going to discuss the identification, management, and monitoring of governance and compliance risks. Having defined governance and compliance risks in our last session, today we proceed to learn how to identify, how to manage, and monitor governance and compliance risks. And the process candidates of effectively addressing governance and compliance risks is cyclical. The process is cyclical and involves a continuous effort across the organization. And the core components of a robust enterprise risk management framework include identification, managing, and monitoring of governance and compliance risks. So those are three areas. One is identification. Identifying. How do you identify governance and compliance risks? Now, identification is the first critical step, which requires a systematic approach to uncover potential threats to the organization's governance framework and its adherence to rules. So identifying governance and compliance risks is the first step in this cycle. And there are various methods that can be used to identify governance and compliance risks. Let's outline the methods. What are the methods that can be employed to identify governance and compliance risks? One is having risk workshops and brainstorming. Risk workshops and brainstorming. Having risk workshops and brainstorming. Risk workshops. Now, this involves key personnel from various departments. The departments could be the legal department, the finance department, operations department, HR, IT, internal audit, the senior management, and even the board members. They can come together and brainstorm and try and identify the governance and compliance risks in the organization, having workshops that comprises of personnel from different departments that I've named. Then they may have facilitated discussions to identify potential scenarios where governance principles might be breached or where non-compliance could occur. You understand? They may discuss specific risks related to local legislation like the Data Protection, the Companies Act, the specific sector regulations, political instability. We may also have the perception, corruption perception, cultural aspects, and so on. That's one way to identify risks. Let me rewrite these candidates. We are discussing methods that can be used to identify governance and compliance risks. One method is risk workshops and brainstorming sessions. 2, conducting regulatory scannings and legal review. That's another way to identify governance and compliance risks. That is to mean establishing a process to continuously monitor changes in laws, regulations, industry standards relevant to the organization's operations. Regulatory scanning, having people within the organization who are scanning the legal environment, finding out if there are new laws that are coming out. You understand? Or it could just be engaging a legal counsel to interpret new or amended legislation and then assess its impact. In the Kenyan context, you may have regulatory review updates from the Kenya Revenue Authority, from the Capital Markets Authority, from the Central Bank of Kenya, from NEMA, and other relevant regulatory bodies. The company can decide to subscribe to legal updates from law firms, which also is very critical. So regulatory scanning and legal reviews can be a method that a company can use to identify the governance and compliance audits. The third way is internal control assessments. Internal control assessments involve evaluating the design and operating effectiveness of existing internal controls, where we may have, for example, weak controls. That could be an indicator of increased governance and compliance risks. So if you have a weak internal control system, after carrying out an internal control assessment, that would indicate the presence of governance and compliance risks. Internal control assessment is another way. So the company can utilize the frameworks like COSO to identify control gaps. Moving on to the third method, the fourth method is past incidents. Past incidents together with near miss analysis and near miss analysis. That means reviewing historical instances of non-compliance, historical instances of legal breaches, internal policy violations, and governance failures. So that's one way to identify risks. You can go back to the history of the company and find out if the company has violated laws in the past. This analysis can extend to what we call near misses analysis. These are situations where a risk nearly materialized but was averted. Near missed analysis. This provides valuable insights into vulnerabilities, where there was a risk that was likely to occur, but it was somehow interrupted and avoided. So past incidents and near missed analysis or near misses. 5. Industry. We have industry benchmarks and peer analysis. This is another way to use to identify governance and compliance risks. This means comparing the organization's governance practices and compliance track record against industry peers and best practices, or just learning from compliance failures or governance scandals of other organizations, both locally and internationally. Because what befalls other companies can also befall your company. So you look at what other companies are grappling with. That can give you a hint of what you may expect in your organization in terms of identification of governance and compliance risks. Now, candidates, you are identifying methods that can be used to identify governance and compliance risks. The 6th method is stakeholder feedback. Stakeholder feedback. Stakeholders are employees, shareholders, regulators, suppliers, and so on. The company can engage with the employees through whistleblowing hotlines, through internal surveys. It can engage customers and suppliers and regulators as well, and that can often provide early warnings of potential issues. For example, listening to concerns from customer protection bodies, labor unions, community groups, and so on. Stakeholder feedback, getting feedback from stakeholders. 7, external audits. External audits and reviews. External audits. External audits and reviews is also another method that can be used to identify risks. This is findings from statutory financial audits, findings from legal audits, findings from special reviews, all right, specific compliance reviews like cybersecurity audits. These areas can highlight risks, external audits and reviews. Statutory audits, legal audits, and so on. 8, strategic planning reviews. Strategic plan reviews. For example, analyzing new business initiatives, analyzing new products, analyzing new markets for the inherent governance and compliance risks. For example, expanding into a new African country will introduce new regulatory compliance challenges. That's another way to identify strategic planning reviews. So these are 8 methods that one can use to identify governance and compliance risks. Let's move to managing. This is identifying. How about managing? Managing. We are discussing managing of governance and compliance risks. The first step is to first identify the risks, and these methods can be used to identify the risks. Having identified the risks, then the risks to be managed. Once identified, risks need to be managed through appropriate strategies and controls. So what are these strategies that can be used to manage governance and compliance risks? What are the strategies? Now, the strategies that can be used to manage governance and compliance risks include policy and procedure development. Policy and procedure development. That means establishing clear, comprehensive, and up-to-date policies, procedures, and guidelines that can articulate the organization's stance on governance and compliance. Examples include having code of conduct, whistleblowing policy, data protection policy, anti-bribery and corruption policy, conflict of interest policy, IT usage policy, procurement policy, and so on. Developing all these policies to address the risks that are identified. Because a policy is a guideline. So the company can develop a guideline on how to manage the identified risks. For example, from a Kenyan context, you can ensure that policies specifically address local requirements like Bribery Act, like Data Protection Act, like Gender Equality Guidelines, and so on. So there ought to be policies in place that address all these aspects. If there is a Bribery Act in place, then there ought to be policy that addresses the issues raised in the Bribery Act. If there is a Data Protection Act, then there ought to be policies that respond to the provisions of the Data Protection Act. Number 2, strong internal control system. Having a strong internal control system is another strategy to manage governance and compliance risks. Implementing a robust prevention and detection controls to mitigate identified risks. You may have preventing controls such as segregation of duties, authorization limits, mandatory training, physical security. You could also have detective controls such as regular reconciliations, internal audits, management reviews, data analytics for anomalies, and so on. So the company can have a strong internal control system in place that can manage governance and compliance risks. The third strategy is training and awareness programs. Having in place training and awareness programs to educate all employees from the board to frontline staff on relevant laws, regulations, and internal policies and ethical expectations. There should also be regular refresher training to keep knowledge current. For example, training on anti-corruption, training on sexual harassment in the workplace, training on data privacy, and so on. 4. Clear roles and responsibilities. Having clear roles and responsibilities. Defining clear ownership for governance and compliance responsibilities at all levels, from the board to management and to individual employees. The company should establish a dedicated compliance function or officer if warranted by the organization size and complexity. If the company is complex, then there ought to be a governance and compliance officer who can help in drafting and ensuring that each individual has responsibilities clearly in place. So clear roles and responsibilities is another strategy to manage risks. 5. Technological solutions. Technological solutions, utilizing governance and risk and compliance software to centralize risk registers, to track compliance requirements, to manage policy distribution, and also monitor incidents. So the company can implement automated controls within IT systems to enforce policies, for example, access controls, data encryption, and so on, using technology. The sixth strategy to manage risks is incident response plan. Incident response. Having an incident response plan. That means developing and regularly testing a plan for responding to identified governance breaches or compliance violations. And that includes investigation, it includes remediation, it includes communication. And this communication could be to the regulators or affected parties, and also it may include disciplinary action. 7, we have board and committee oversight. This is yet another strategy. Board and committee oversight. This is ensuring the board, particularly the audit committee and risk committees, provide effective oversight of governance and compliance frameworks. It may also involve regular reporting to the board on risk status, on control effectiveness, and compliance performance. Sanctions and disciplinary actions. And disciplinary action. Sanctions and disciplinary action is another strategy to manage risks. This means implementing clear disciplinary procedures for non-compliance to reinforce the importance of adherence and also to deter future violations. So these are 8 strategies to manage governance and compliance risks. Let's move to monitoring. Monitoring. Let me have it here. Monitoring. How do you monitor risks? Now, monitoring is the ongoing process of assessing the effectiveness of risk management strategies and controls and identifying new or evolving risks. And there are various methods of monitoring. One method is through what we call continuous monitoring. Continuous monitoring. This could be automated systems that continuously check for compliance with rules, like transaction monitoring systems in banks. We may also have real-time dashboards for key risk indicators and key performance indicators related to governance and compliance. Another way to monitor is through regular compliance reviews. And audits. Regular compliance reviews and audits, like scheduled internal audits by the internal audit function to test specific compliance areas like tax compliance audit, the human resource compliance audits, the IT security audit, and so on. Regular compliance audit may also involve periodic legal audits conducted by external legal counsel. For example, you may have what we call annual statutory governance audits for listed companies as per the capital markets requirements. 3. Management self-assessment. Management self-assessment is another method that we can use to monitor governance and compliance risks. Managers periodically assess their own departments' adherence to policies and controls, which can help identify weaknesses and also implement corrective actions. 4. Whistleblowing. Mechanism. Whistleblowing mechanism analysis. This means regularly reviewing and analyzing reports received through whistleblowing channels to identify systematic governance or compliance issues. For example, the company can choose to ensure the mechanism is accessible, is confidential, and also protects whistleblowers as per the Protected Disclosures Act or any relevant act. 5. Regulatory. You may also have regulatory changes tracking. Regulatory changes tracking. That can also be used to monitor governance and compliance risks. This is simply the ongoing vigilance to identify new or amended laws and regulations that might introduce new compliance requirements or risks, then adjusting policies and procedures promptly in response to these changes. 6. Performance reporting. Performance reporting is another method that can be used to monitor governance and compliance risks. These are regular reports to senior management and the board on the status of governance and compliance, including identified breaches, including corrective actions taken, and also the overall risk profile. You understand? Performance reporting may also include metrics on training completion, policy adherence rates, okay, adherence rates, and also incident rates. 7, independent assurance. Independence assurance is another method where you engage external auditors or consultants to provide independent assurance on the effectiveness of governance and compliance framework. Independent assurance. You understand, Candice? So that's it for our today's lesson on identifying, managing, and monitoring governance and compliance risks. So by systematically implementing these identification, management, and monitoring activities, organizations can build resilience against compliance and governance risks. Organizations, by so doing, can protect their reputation. Organizations can avoid penalties and foster a sustainable and ethical business environment. So it's very critical for organizations to put in place mechanisms of identifying, managing, and monitoring governance and compliance risks. We've discussed the 3 major areas. We started by identifying governance and compliance risks. And we've said one way or method that can be used to identify risks is through risk workshops and brainstorming sessions. Number 2, regulatory scanning and legal reviews. Number 3, internal control assessments. Number 4, past incidents and near-missed analysis. Number 5, you have industry benchmarks and peer analysis. Number 6, stakeholder feedback. Number 7, external audits and reviews. Number 8, strategic planning reviews. Then we have also identified 8 strategies that can be used to manage governance and compliance risks. Number 1 is policy and procedure development. Number 2, having a strong internal control system. Number 3, training and awareness programs. Number 4, clear roles and responsibilities. Number 5, technological solutions. Number 6, incident response plans. Number 7, board and committee oversight. Number 8, sanctions and disciplinary action. Then we have identified ways or methods to monitor governance and compliance risks. Number 1 is continuous monitoring. Number 2, regular compliance reviews and audits. Number 3, management self-assessment. Number 4, whistleblowing mechanism analysis. Number 5, regulatory changes tracking. Number 6, you have performance reporting. And lastly, independence assurance. Thank you for attending the lesson. In our next session, we are going to study the impact of non-compliance. Bye-bye.